Welcome to the Plain Books podcast. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this underlying expectation of like absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like it's structural engineering or something.
Exactly. You fall off your bike, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points at it. There is the fracture. There is the truth.
It provides this undeniable objective reality. The bone is broken or the bone is intact. The blood test shows an elevated enzyme or, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And as human beings, we are deeply comforted by things that are visible, things that are quantifiable and just neatly categorized into distinct boxes. It gives us this illusion of total control over our biology.
Oh, 100%. But then you step out of the orthopedic ward and into the realm of human consciousness. You step into the world of neurodevelopment, of emotional trauma, of shifting moods and perceptions, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. I mean, it is subjective, it is terrifying, and honestly, it is also profoundly beautiful.
It's the ultimate diagnostic gray area, really. When we deal with the mind, the clear, jagged white lines just vanish.
Yeah, they're gone.
The categories we try to force upon human suffering are constantly shifting and evolving and overlapping. We are basically trying to measure a moving target with a static ruler.
Which is exactly why we are dedicating this entire episode to an absolutely monumental piece of work. Today, we are exploring a book that takes a sledgehammer to that static ruler. It's called The Unfragile Mind, a physician's call for restoring hope and humanity to mental health care by Gavin Francis, with a foreword by K. Redfield Jamison.
Such an incredible book.
It really is. And our mission for this episode, for this expansive marathon of ideas we're doing today, is to fundamentally examine the dynamic, adaptable, and ultimately unfragile nature of the human mind, just as Dr. Francis presents it. We want to challenge you, listening to this right now, to completely reevaluate how you think about mental health, about the nature of suffering, and really about your own resilience.
And the stakes of this discussion are incredibly high. I mean, Francis is asking us to look directly at the clinical frontline. We're going to explore the raw, messy, and sometimes profoundly frightening realities of the emergency room, the psychiatric ward, the general practice clinic.
Right.
And from those extremes, he asks us to draw a completely different conclusion about human nature than the biological determinism that modern society usually feeds us.
We are going to take you right into the thick of it. We're looking at drug-induced frenzies, at people experiencing profound, altered realities, individuals in the grip of absolute terror, and others experiencing a literal fire hose of overwhelming epiphanies.
It's intense.
It's so intense. And yet the promise we are making to you today is that by the end of this podcast, you will have the tools to view your own mind not as some fragile glass structure that just shatters at the first sign of stress, but as a deeply adaptable, ever-flowing river.
And a river is the perfect metaphor because a river never truly breaks.
Yeah, exactly.
It might be dammed up, it might flood, it might carve a completely new path through solid rock when it meets an obstacle, but it continues to flow. That relentless adaptability is the core of what Francis means by unfragile.
Let's look at how the medical establishment currently tries to map that river, though, because Francis dedicates a significant portion of his work to critiquing the current Bibles of Western psychiatry. I'm talking specifically about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, and the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD.
Right. And to understand his critique, we kind of have to look at the history of how these manuals actually function. Francis points out that over the last few decades, society and even medical professionals have started to treat the DSM as if it were a catalog of ultimate, objective scientific truths about the human brain.
Like the periodic table of elements.
Exactly. We treat it like the periodic table. But the reality is far messier. It is essentially a consensus document. It's created by committees of specialists who just, vote on criteria.
And beyond the voting and the committees, there is a distinctly bureaucratic engine driving it, especially in the United States. It has evolved largely into a healthcare billing manual.
Yep.
If a patient wants their insurance company to pay for cognitive behavioral therapy, the clinician needs a billing code. To get that billing code, the clinician has to assign a specific label from the DSM.
So the administrative tail is essentially wagging the clinical dog. And Francis brings in a brilliant philosophical concept here. He quotes the Italian psychiatrist Paolo Malone, as well as Jean-Paul Sartre, to emphasize that these diagnostic manuals are merely maps of the mind. And there's that famous philosophical adage,
The map is not the territory.
Yes. The map is not a territory. A map is just a two-dimensional model of how to navigate a space. But in modern psychiatry, we have fallen into the dangerous trap of reifying diagnoses.
Reifying, let's break that down because it's central to everything we're discussing today in this episode. To reify something means to take an abstract concept, like a cluster of emotional symptoms, and treat it as if it is a concrete, physical object.
Precisely. We take an abstract description of suffering and start believing it's a biological entity lurking inside the brain, like a tumor or a virus. We forget that the label was just a shorthand we invented to describe a pattern of behavior.
And the statistics Francis presents regarding this reification are just staggering. Because we have systematically lowered the diagnostic thresholds and broadened the criteria for what counts as a disorder over the successive editions of the DSM, we are witnessing an epidemic of overdiagnosis.
It's massive.
The book cites research showing that in the United States, 50% of the population will meet the criteria for a mental illness at some point in their lifetimes. Half the country.
When you cast a diagnostic net that incredibly wide, you have to critically evaluate what you are actually catching in it. I mean, are we genuinely uncovering an epidemic of biological pathology? Or have we simply started pathologizing the normal, painful spectrum of the human experience?
Right, like grief, heartbreak, existential anxiety.
Exactly. These are painful, but they are not necessarily diseases.
And the danger of assigning a label to every form of human struggle is so vividly captured in the book through the words of Esme Weijin Wang. She wrote a powerful memoir about her experiences with schizoaffective disorder, and she makes a chilling observation about the moment she received that label.
Oh, this quote is so powerful.
It really is. She wrote, "My new diagnosis bore no curative function, but it did imply that to be high-functioning would be difficult, if not impossible, for me."
That is the insidious nature of reification. The label literally became a self-fulfilling curse. Medical terminology carries immense, almost magical authority in our society.
Yeah, it does.
When an expert in a white coat tells you that you possess a chronic, incurable brain disorder, it drastically shrinks your psychological horizon. You stop seeing yourself as a person going through a severe crisis, and you start seeing yourself as a broken machine.
It fundamentally alters your identity, and clinicians themselves are becoming acutely aware of this absurdity. The book highlights Dr. Benji Waterhouse, an NHS psychiatrist in Britain, who offers a deeply cynical but necessary critique of this system.
His stuff is hilarious, but also so sad.
Right. He jokes about the endless forms he has to fill out, suggesting that the complex medical-sounding codes he enters could honestly be replaced by NFI for no fucking idea, or SLS for shit life syndrome, or simply PNA. Pretty normal, actually.
Waterhouse's dark humor cuts right to the core of the issue. I mean, a patient might come in profoundly depressed, and the diagnostic manual demands a biological label. But the reality is the patient is working 3 jobs, going through a bitter divorce, and hasn't slept properly in months.
So calling that a biological brain disease completely ignores the context of their shit life syndrome.
Exactly.
But I do want to push back on this a bit, though, because while I see the danger of the label becoming a curse, doesn't giving a patient a formal diagnosis also provide a massive amount of validation? I mean, imagine you are waking up every single day feeling this crushing, invisible weight on your chest. You feel like you are failing at life. If a doctor looks at you and says, you aren't weak, you aren't crazy, you have major depressive disorder, isn't that a profound relief? It destigmatizes the pain and tells the patient this isn't your fault.
You are hitting on the central paradox of modern psychiatry. And Francis absolutely does not dismiss that reality. Claiming a diagnostic label can absolutely validate suffering. It neutralizes the patient's internal guilt and connects them to a community of others who share that label, proving they are not alone.
Right.
However, we have to look at the long-term cost of that validation. If the cost of feeling validated today is locking yourself into a rigid, hopeless framework for the rest of your life, the trade-off is incredibly dangerous.
So it's about finding a balance between acknowledging the pain without sealing the patient's fate.
Exactly. And the most compelling voice on this comes from inside the psychiatric establishment itself. The book brings in Gavin Francis. And he is not a fringe critic. He was actually the architect of the DSM-IV, the previous edition of the manual.
Wow.
Yeah, he is currently sounding the alarm about what his own field has become.
So the very person who helped write the rulebook is saying the rules are broken. What is his specific concern?
He warns against what he terms the diagnostic exuberance of the newer DSM-5. He argues that the manual has ambitiously and recklessly mislabeled everyday sadness, normal anxiety, grief, and standard stress responses as psychiatric disorders.
So we're medicalizing just being human.
Yes, By medicalizing the inescapable struggles of the human condition, we are pushing massive over-medication. Francis argues that the field desperately needs a Goldilocks just right balance to avoid missing patients who genuinely need psychiatric intervention, while protecting everyday people from being mislabeled and unnecessarily medicated.
For you, the listener, this reframes everything. If you have been handed a map, a diagnostic label that makes your world feel smaller, that makes you feel fragile, you do not have to accept it as the ultimate biological truth of who you are.
Right.
The map is not the territory. But that begs a massive question. If these rigid labels and diagnostic boxes are flawed and potentially harmful, how should we actually understand and navigate the mind when it is suffering? What is the alternative to the biological disease model?
This is where Francis introduces what I consider the most revolutionary paradigm shift in the book. If we abandon the idea that mental suffering is always caused by a discrete, verifiable disease hiding in the brain like a hidden tumor, we need a new framework for understanding a psychological breakdown.
Okay.
This brings us to the network theory of mental disorders, formalized around 2017 by the Dutch psychologist Denny Boersboom.
Network theory. This concept completely flipped my understanding of mental health upside down.
Boersboom started with a very pragmatic observation. After decades of searching, biological psychiatry has largely failed to find the specific, isolated biological causes, the broken chemical, for most psychiatric disorders.
Okay.
So rather than continuing to search for a phantom disease, network theory proposes something radically different. It suggests that in vulnerable people there is no single underlying disease causing the symptoms. Instead, the symptoms cause each other.
The symptoms cause each other. Wait, let's slow down and really map out the mechanics of this, because it is a profound departure from how we usually think about illness. If you have a cold, the virus causes the cough. The virus causes the fever.
Exactly.
The cough doesn't cause the fever. But Boersboom is saying in mental health, the symptoms themselves are the engine. Francis gives a highly specific example in the book to illustrate this. Let's say an individual develops a delusion. For instance, they genuinely believe that other people can read their thoughts.
An incredibly intrusive and terrifying cognitive event.
Right. Now, in the old model, we would say, what underlying brain disease is causing this delusion? Network theory says, let's look at what the delusion does. That single symptom, the delusion that people can read your mind, generates a secondary symptom. Extreme suspicion and paranoia. You become terrified of anyone getting too close to you.
And that secondary symptom, the paranoia, naturally drives a behavioral change. It leads the person to actively avoid others, which results in a third symptom, severe social isolation.
And here is the critical mechanism where the network locks in and becomes a disorder. Because the person is now socially isolated, they are completely removed from the corrective social feedback of everyday life. They aren't having those casual, grounding interactions with a cashier or a neighbor that implicitly prove no one is reading their mind.
Because that grounding feedback is gone, the original delusion is left unchecked. In fact, the isolation sustains and intensifies the delusion.
So they feed on each other.
Yes. The delusion creates the paranoia creates the isolation, and the isolation reinforces the delusion. It is a closed, self-sustaining loop. The network of symptoms has become autonomous.
It reminds me of an acoustic feedback loop at a live concert. Imagine a microphone gets too close to a speaker. The microphone picks up a tiny ambient sound, sends it through the wire to the speaker amplifies it, and then the microphone picks up that newly amplified sound.
And then it just escalates.
Yeah, it sends it back again, and within seconds you have this deafening, screeching loop that makes everyone cover their ears.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
If you approach that screeching noise using the traditional medical model, you would assume there is a broken component inside the microphone. You would take the microphone apart, looking for a faulty wire. But network theory says the microphone is perfectly fine. The speaker is perfectly fine.
Right.
The problem is entirely based on the spatial arrangement of the elements in that specific room. The goal isn't to fix a broken microphone. The goal is to step onto the stage and physically move the microphone away from the speaker to break the loop.
And translating that acoustic analogy back to clinical psychiatry, the implications are massively empowering. It shifts the entire focus of treatment. Instead of a clinician endlessly searching for an elusive chemical imbalance that cannot be definitively proven or easily fixed, they can focus on practical interventions to weaken the connections between the symptoms.
You intervene at the points of the loop that are actually accessible.
Exactly. So if we apply that to the person suffering from the mind-reading delusion, you don't necessarily start by trying to medically eliminate the delusion itself.
Because that might be impossible right away.
Precisely. You might start by tackling the social isolation. If a clinician or a support network can help that person gently re-engage socially in a safe environment, you introduce corrective feedback. You break the isolation node of the network.
Oh, wow.
By dampening the isolation, the paranoia decreases, and without the paranoia fueling it, the delusion begins to lose its absolute grip on the person's reality. You are moving the microphone away from the speaker.
It transforms psychiatric care from a passive waiting game for the right pill into an active, collaborative untangling of a knot. But this theory also forces us to ask a difficult question about inherent vulnerability.
What do you mean?
Well, if we go back to the concert stage, why does one person's microphone feed back instantly the moment they step near a speaker, while another person can stand directly in front of the amp with their mic and experience absolutely no feedback? Why do some minds tip into these self-sustaining loops so much faster than others?
That's a great point. Francis addresses this variance in vulnerability by referencing the dandelion versus orchid theory of human psychology and genetics.
Okay, dandelions and orchids.
Yeah. This theory posits that certain individuals are biologically and temperamentally akin to dandelions. They are incredibly hardy, resilient, and robust. They can take root and survive at almost any environment, even pushing their way up through the cracks in a concrete sidewalk.
They are the people who seem unfazed by chaos.
Mm.
They can work in a high-stress environment, sleep poorly, and still essentially function without falling apart.
Exactly. But a significant portion of the population are orchids. Orchids are exquisitely, highly sensitive to their surrounding environment. If the temperature is slightly off, if the soil acidity isn't perfect, or if the light is too harsh, the orchid will rapidly wither and struggle to survive.
So their internal network of symptoms is primed to feedback much faster under stress.
Right.
So an orchid in a chaotic hospital environment is going to look deeply disordered. They're going to look fragile.
But here is the critical pivot of the theory. When you take that exact same highly sensitive orchid and place it into a nurturing, perfectly calibrated environment, it doesn't just survive. It blooms into something spectacular, often far surpassing the dandelion in its complexity and beauty. Their sensitivity becomes their greatest asset.
I think about how this applies to modern corporate environments or the modern education system. We have essentially built a society out of concrete sidewalks, which is great for the dandelions. Open-plan offices with constant noise, relentless digital connectivity, extreme productivity demands.
Oh, it's a nightmare for an orchid.
Right. If you are an orchid in an open-plan office, your nervous system is constantly overwhelmed. You might get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or an attention deficit, but the network theory and the orchid theory suggest your brain isn't necessarily diseased. It is having a highly predictable reaction to a toxic environment.
It emphasizes that human suffering is profoundly context-driven. You simply cannot separate the mind from the ecosystem it inhabits. And to truly understand this adaptability and this vulnerability, Francis doesn't just rely on abstract theories. He grounds his book in the visceral reality of his own career.
Yeah, his stories are incredible.
He takes us directly to the extreme environments where human minds actually break down, and miraculously where they piece themselves back together. He takes us to the emergency room.
And this is where Francis's background as a general practitioner and an emergency medicine doctor brings the book to life. He isn't observing these phenomena from a distant academic tower. I mean, he is in the trenches. He provides these incredibly vivid sensory anecdotes from the clinical frontline that completely shatter the neat, sanitized checkboxes of the DSM.
He shows us the mind under the most extreme forms of duress.
One of the most striking stories early on is about a baby named Claire. Francis describes being on a pediatrics night shift. He is assigned to help feed a newborn in the special care unit who had suffered a severe brain hemorrhage during a traumatic birth.
Such a heartbreaking scenario.
It is. Now, a hemorrhage is a massive physical insult to the brain. Nobody in that ward knew what her future held, whether she would face severe lifelong impairments or whether she would somehow adapt. Francis is holding her, and he describes her as a raw, versatile seedling of consciousness. He talks about her holding allegiance to a dreamlike world, hovering between existence and non-existence.
It is a deeply poetic observation, but it is rooted in hardcore neuroscience. The infant brain is the ultimate manifestation of the unfragile mind. Even after a catastrophic physical trauma like a bleed, the newborn brain possesses a supreme, almost miraculous versatility.
Because of neuroplasticity, right?
Exactly. It has a genius for neuroplasticity, for rewiring itself, compensating for damaged areas by assigning those functions to healthy tissue. It is pure potential.
But the tragedy of human development is that this pure potential often collides with hostile environments. Francis moves from the quiet of the neonatal unit into the absolute chaos of a weekend night shift in the adult ER. He paints a picture of a single shift that serves as a crucible of human suffering.
The contrast between the patients in the ER brilliantly illustrates the vast, unpredictable spectrum of human coping mechanisms.
Yeah, in one cubicle, he treats a 35-year-old woman who is deeply addicted to cocaine and heroin. Her arms are covered in the physical scars of self-harm. She is in the ER, absolutely desperate to prove she is getting clean because she wants to regain custody of her son from the foster care system.
Such a brutal reality.
It is, but she is so damaged, her nervous system is so hijacked by the addiction that she cannot break the cycle. She urgently needs a way to regulate her pain, to just feel a momentary sense of okayness, and the illicit drugs are the only pathway her brain currently knows how to access.
And literally in the next cubicle over, during that same shift, he is treating an 85-year-old woman who has suffered a severe bleeding head wound from a fall. Yet despite the pain and the blood, she is sitting on the gurney, happily singing ABA songs to the nursing staff.
Which is just wild to picture.
It is. And then the doors burst open and the paramedics wheel in a 30-year-old drug dealer. He had literally jumped out of a 5-story window to escape a police raid. His ankles are completely shattered, bone protruding. Yet instead of crying in pain, he is violently yelling abuse and threats at the doctors and nurses while they attempt to physically stabilize his legs.
As an outsider, or even as a junior doctor, you look at that chaotic room and you just see brokenness, you see pathology everywhere. But Francis asks us to look deeper. How is a clinician supposed to make sense of this chaos? Francis argues that these are not just examples of broken minds, they are examples of the mind aggressively trying to survive trauma.
Exactly.
Let's break down the mechanics of that survival, particularly with the addiction case. Why does the 35-year-old mother stay trapped in that cycle when she desperately wants her child back? The biological disease model says her brain chemistry is just faulty, but Francis looks at the biology of trauma.
He emphasizes that severe trauma, especially developmental trauma or chronic neglect, physically and psychologically terraforms the landscape of the mind. A child who grows up in an environment of unpredictable violence or emotional starvation learns, at a neurological level, that the world is inherently threatening.
So their brain fundamentally wires differently.
Yes. Their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hypersensitive. Their internal alarm system is constantly tripped, flooding their body with cortisol and adrenaline.
So they're living in a permanent state of fight or flight.
Exactly. And when you are in a permanent state of fight or flight, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, emotional regulation, and trust, is downregulated. They find it neurologically incredibly difficult to trust others, to build the very social relationships that Bohr's network theory says are necessary to prevent psychological collapse.
So they turn to the drugs.
Right. Isolated and in constant agony, they turn to the intense, brief sensory indulgences of chemical addiction just to survive the noise in their own heads.
The addiction isn't the primary disease. It is a brutal, desperate coping mechanism for an unlivable internal environment. It is the mind adapting to horror. But even in these incredibly bleak circumstances, Francis insists that positive adaptation and rebirth are always possible.
They are.
He shares a story that I think serves as the central metaphor for the entire book. It is about a patient in his general practice named Paul.
The story of Paul is extraordinary.
Paul was a patient who had been through profound struggles navigating his own internal darkness. One day, he comes into Francis's consulting room for a routine appointment, and he pulls a plant pot out of a plastic supermarket bag. Inside the pot is what looks like a completely dead, gray, woody stump. But Paul points to it amazed because from halfway up that supposedly dead stem, a vibrant, perfect flower had inexplicably erupted. Paul looked at Francis and said, "I thought it was incredible. I was so sure it was dead."
It is a stunning visual representation of the mind's capacity for regeneration. The stump appeared dead to the world. It had likely endured drought or frost. Yet, deep inside its cellular structure, it retained the latent capacity to bloom when the conditions shifted even slightly.
Yeah.
Paul recognized his own psychological journey in that plant. It was proof to him that a sense of grounding, beauty, and ease could be restored after a period of total barrenness.
And the book quotes the therapist and author Clarissa Pinkola Estes to explain how this kind of adaptation occurs. She talks about the process of adapting to severe trauma not as getting over it, but as a kind of conscious forgetting.
Which is an interesting
It
phrase.
is, and she clarifies that this doesn't mean literally erasing the memory of the trauma, which is impossible. Instead, it means deliberately distancing oneself from the emotional epicenter of it. It is the hard work of laying the violent emotions surrounding the memory to rest, allowing the individual to create a new psychological landscape on top of the old ruins.
To achieve that conscious distancing, we have to build protective structures within our minds. Francis leans on K. Redfield Jamison's concept of internal seawalls. Jameson writes beautifully about how human beings must construct these walls to keep the overwhelming chaotic forces of life and the inherent sadnesses within our own minds at bay.
We build these seawalls stone by stone over the course of a lifetime. We use the mortar of love, the routine of fulfilling work, the structure of family, the belief of faith.
But importantly, we also sometimes build them out of less healthy materials. We use the stones of denial, the mortar of alcohol, or the rigid structure of heavy psychiatric medication. The seawalls are whatever we need them to be to stop the floodwaters from drowning us.
I want to pause the discussion right here and challenge you, the listener, to actively apply this to yourself. Think about the architecture of your own mind. Look at your life right now. What internal seawalls have you built to keep the overwhelming forces of modern life at bay? Look at your daily routine. Are you using your obsessive dedication to your career as a wall?
That's a common one.
Yeah. Are you using scrolling on your phone for 4 hours a night as a wall to block out anxiety? Are those walls made of healthy, sustainable stones like community, genuine purpose, and physical health? Or are they constructed out of avoidance, distraction, and numbing? It is a heavy, confronting question, but identifying the materials of your own seawalls is the first step toward understanding your unfragility.
It is a vital exercise because those walls, whatever they are made of, are what keep us anchored to our shared reality. But the most fascinating and terrifying explorations in Francis's book occur when he asks, what happens when those boundaries dissolve completely? What happens when the seawall doesn't just crack under the pressure of trauma, but completely washes away in a flood of overwhelming, terrifying awe?
That transition takes us from the trauma of the ER into the dizzying heights and terrifying depths of mania and psychosis. Francis describes the manic state using a phrase that I absolutely cannot stop thinking about. He calls mania a fire hose of epiphanies.
It is a brilliant descriptor because it captures the immense velocity and pressure of the experience, something that sterile clinical language completely fails to convey.
He talks extensively about K. Redfield Jamison here. She's in a unique position because not only is she a renowned professor of psychiatry, but she also has bipolar disorder herself. She has lived inside these extreme states. Francis refers to her as a dedicated field reporter, someone who journeys into the farthest, most dangerous landscapes of the human mind and brings back detailed accounts of what it actually feels like to be there.
And her accounts reveal that mania is simultaneously exhilarating and utterly terrifying. Francis quotes Clifford Beers, an early 20th century writer who chronicled his own bipolar disorder. Beers described the onset of mania as feeling like the refreshing breath of a goddess of wisdom being gently blown against the surface of his brain.
Wow.
It feels delicate, crisp, and filled with divine clarity. The patient feels as though they have suddenly unlocked the secrets of the universe.
But the tragedy of the fire hose is that you cannot turn it off. That crisp breeze quickly escalates into a hurricane. Reality blurs. The connections between thoughts become so fast and so bizarre that the person loses their tether to everyone else. And suddenly, that awful, divine place becomes a prison because you realize the people around you aren't looking at you with shared wonder. They are looking at you with deep, frightened concern.
And this brings us to one of the most culturally significant questions the book raises. How do we, as a society, handle individuals who enter these extreme, transformed states? Francis points out a notoriously puzzling, well-documented fact in global psychiatry. The long-term clinical outcomes for individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia are surprisingly consistently better in the developing nations of the global South than they are in the highly medicalized, affluent West.
That feels completely counterintuitive. I mean, we have the best hospitals, the newest pharmaceuticals, the most advanced neuroimaging. Why are people recovering better in environments with fewer medical resources?
The answer lies exactly in the network theory and the concept of reification we discussed earlier. The book suggests that in many poorer, non-Western countries, the cultural framework for understanding madness is fundamentally different. First, the kinship networks, Extended families, local communities, are often much stronger and more deeply integrated.
Oh, I see. So going back to Borsboom's network theory, the node of social isolation is much harder to activate. The family simply doesn't allow the individual to become isolated, which prevents the delusion, paranoia, isolation feedback loop from fully locking in.
Exactly. The social structure literally interrupts the pathology. But even more profoundly, these cultures often possess a much greater tolerance for mystical, spiritual, or transformed states of mind. If a young man begins hearing voices or having visions, the community might view him as having been temporarily touched by the spirit world or going through a spiritual crisis. They do not immediately stamp them with a permanent biomedical label of a broken brain.
They accept that the state is temporary and potentially meaningful, rather than chronic and meaningless.
Yes. And because the culture validates the experience as part of the human spectrum, the secondary symptoms of deep shame, stigma, and societal rejection never fully materialize. The patient's cortisol levels drop because they are not being treated as a terrifying outcast.
Whereas in the West, if you view madness purely as an irreversible biological brain disease, you gain a very neat objective framework for the doctor. But as Francis warns, you strip the patient of their humanity. You lose any chance of finding something redemptive or instructive in the horror of their experience. You close off the possibility that the psychotic break or the delusion might actually be integrated into a meaningful narrative of their life.
Francis brings in the perspective of the late, great historical novelist Hilary Mantel to beautifully illustrate this need for meaning. Mantel deeply admired the work of the controversial mid-20th century psychiatrist R.D. Longing.
Right, Lawling.
Yeah. Long wrote a famous, highly polarizing book detailing the case studies of women who had been institutionalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia. He argued their madness was a rational response to insane family dynamics.
Mantell led a seminar on Lang's book, and her framing of these patients is heartbreakingly empathetic. She opened the seminar by saying, "These women are my drowned sisters, and with these seminars, I'm trying to bring them back to the surface." She completely rejected the sterile medical gaze. She saw their psychological disintegration not as a random biological glitch, but as a gallant, persistent, desperate striving towards healing in the face of how people damage each other.
She recognized the profound agency hidden inside the madness. And Francis provides another powerful example of this with the Scottish poet John Burnside. Burnside wrote a memoir detailing his time locked in a psychiatric ward. He was fully aware he had suffered a severe breakdown, but crucially, he refused to internalize the medical martyr's view of it as a meaningless illness.
He reframed the entire experience using a fascinating concept. He describes his breakdown as a spike in apophenia.
Apophenia is a wonderful term. It is the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns and connections between completely unrelated things. Seeing faces in the clouds is a mild form of apophenia.
Burnside realized that his psychosis was simply apophenia dialed up to a terrifying extreme. His brain was aggressively finding elaborate cosmic significance in the way a shadow fell across the floor, or the specific sequence of numbers on a passing bus. By framing it as an extreme spike of a normal human trait, he retained his dignity. He gave his breakdown a redemptive, powerful interpretation that he could integrate into his identity as a poet.
He refused to let the diagnostic manual strip away his meaning. Which begs the question, what else are our diagnostic manuals stripping away?
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because as I read this section, I couldn't help but wonder, have we, in our hyperproductive, industrialized, aggressively secular society, pathologized states of mind that ancient cultures would have revered? We demand constant flatline emotional stability so people can show up to their 9-to-5 jobs and be productive consumers.
We have very little tolerance for the extremes of the human emotional spectrum, unless they are safely contained within art or entertainment.
Francis points this out by reaching back to the philosopher Descartes and the 17th century writer Thomas Browne. They didn't view intense awe or sudden, overwhelming inspiration as symptoms of mania. They viewed wonder as a core, elemental human faculty. It was necessary for encountering the divine. Browne wrote this incredible line, "We carry with us the wonders we seek without us. There is all Africa and her prodigies in us." He was saying the mind contains vast, unexplored continents of strange, terrifying beauty.
But modern society's frightened by those unexplored continents.
Exactly. Did our relentless pursuit of structured, effective scientific knowledge harden us to the point where we lost our capacity for wonder? And now, when wonder surfaces too intensely in an individual, when the fire hose turns on, do we just aggressively medicate it away because it disrupts the machinery of society?
It is a profound, unsettling critique of modernity. Francis notes that for a jaded, burnt-out workforce living in a hyper-connected world, an openness to that raw wonder, a willingness to be overwhelmed by the mystery of existence, can actually be deeply restorative. But it requires surrendering the illusion of total control.
So, if we accept Francis's premise, if we accept that the unfragile mind has this vast, sometimes terrifying, but also beautiful range of states, from the deep, still waters of melancholia to the raging rapids of mania, how are we supposed to live? How do we construct a life that embraces this wild variety while remaining anchored enough not to drown?
That question brings us to the synthesis of Francis's argument, which centers on the concept of psychodiversity and the practical recipe for a flourishing life.
Psychodiversity. We hear the term biodiversity all the time in ecology.
Exactly. In ecology, we understand that a thriving, resilient ecosystem like a rainforest requires a massive, chaotic variety of plants, animals, fungi, and insects to survive. If a disease hits a monocrop farm where only one type of corn is grown, the entire farm dies. But a diverse rainforest adapts and survives.
The book introduces the parallel concept of psychodiversity, which was coined by the psychologist Michael Apter. Apter was deeply frustrated with mainstream psychology's obsession with identifying stable, unchanging personality traits. The prevailing wisdom was that a healthy person is a consistent person.
Apter argued the exact opposite. He suggested that trying to maintain perfect, unchanging emotional stability is akin to running a psychological monocrop farm. It makes you incredibly vulnerable. He argued that to be truly healthy is actually to be functionally unstable. It is the ability to fluidly move between different kinds of personalities, emotional states, and moods to perfectly suit the occasion.
You need the capacity to be aggressively focused at work, deeply playful and silly with your children, profoundly somber and reflective at a funeral, and utterly relaxed on a Sunday morning. If you are stuck in only one of those modes, you suffer.
Just as an ecosystem thrives on biological variety, our minds thrive on experiential diversity. It completely challenges the modern pharmaceutical-driven idea that we must always be emotionally level. Feeling deep sadness after a loss or intense anxiety before a major life change is not a failure of your brain chemistry. It is your psychodiversity functioning exactly as it should.
And crucially, Francis uses this concept to reinforce his final, most urgent assertion. The human mind is essentially social. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is co-created, moment by moment, by the relationships that sustain us. He asks us to completely reject the hyper-individualistic Western view of mental health that places all the fault and all the agonizing burden of fixing it inside the individual's isolated brain chemistry.
We're not isolated brains floating in jars. We are inextricably linked to the people around us. Our networks overlap.
To bring this out of the theoretical and into the practical, Francis gives us some incredible insights into what a flourishing life actually demands. He references Dr. Benji Waterhouse one last time, who wrote a highly detailed, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but devastatingly accurate list of what modern society essentially claims is required for basic human happiness. I have to read this entirely because it highlights the absurdity of our expectations.
It is a phenomenal list.
Waterhouse writes that to be happy, quote, all you need is a healthy birth, secure attachment, happy childhood, minimal or no trauma, high resilience to stress, loving friends, family and partner, fulfilling work, financial security, manageable targets, 8 hours sleep a night, regular exercise, healthy diet, access to nature, limited use of alcohol, drugs, and social media, faith or spirituality, an acceptance of failure and death, an ability to process grief, a naturally positive outlook, maybe a pet, a gratitude journal, plus or minus antidepressants, therapy, and 100% charge on your phone.
It's hilarious because when you read it all at once, you realize it is statistically and practically impossible for any human being to achieve and maintain all of those variables simultaneously.
Exactly. It highlights how absurd and crushing our modern expectations for perfect mental health really are. We feel like failures because we can't check all 30 boxes. But beneath the joke, Francis extracts a profound, ancient, practical truth. A flourishing life does not require perfection. It requires a continuous dynamic balance of effort and ease.
The elements of life that provide the most robust seawalls-deep friendships, raising a family, engaging in satisfying meaningful work, require immense effort. They cause stress. They cause fatigue.
But that effort must be consciously balanced with periods of profound ease, with rest, with play, with stepping into nature and allowing yourself to feel wonder. If you only have effort, you burn out. If you only have ease, you slide into apathy and depression.
And this is where the core lesson of the Unfragile Mind, a physician's call for restoring hope and humanity to mental health care, solidifies into a call to action. We cannot control our genetics. You cannot decide if you were born a dandelion or an orchid. We cannot control the environment we were born into, the economic conditions of our childhood, or the unexpected traumas we may suffer.
But the unfragile mind is not defined by what happens to it. It is defined by how it adapts. We can actively, consciously cultivate the meaning we assign to our suffering. We can meticulously nurture the social connections around us to prevent the network of distress from isolating us. As Francis beautifully puts it, the meaning of life is meaning.
The book leaves us with an incredibly powerful, almost spiritual image of human consciousness. Whether we are currently anxious, traumatized, soaring on a high, sinking in a low, deluded, addicted, or entirely neurodiverse, we are all, at our core, simply vessels. We are vessels for the thoughts, feelings, and intense desires that constantly wash through our being. We are not our transient states of mind.
Those states are just the weather. They are where we live, but they are not who we are. It reminds me of the dual nature of light in quantum physics. The book touches on this brilliant analogy. Physicists can set up an experiment to look at a beam of light, and depending entirely on how they choose to measure it, they will see a wave. But if they change their instrument, if they change their perspective, they look at the exact same light and see a discrete particle.
The light is both, but the observer's choice determines the reality they interact with.
The human brain is exactly the same. How we choose to examine our own minds and the minds of those suffering around us determines the reality we see. If we only look for broken chemicals, rigid diagnostic labels, and inherent fragility, that is all we will ever find. We will build a society of patients. But if we change our perspective, if we look for adaptability, for the pursuit of meaning, and for the deep need for connection, we find an unfragile mind capable of immense rebirth, even from a dead woody stump.
It is a beautifully hopeful, empowering perspective. But it is also demanding. It demands deep humility from the medical establishment, doctors, and psychiatrists, asking them to lay down their maps and look at the actual territory of the patient. And it demands profound courage from all of us to embrace the full, messy, sometimes chaotic spectrum of human consciousness without instantly reaching for a label to make it disappear.
Which brings us to you, our audience. I really want to challenge you to let the ideas from Gavin Francis enhance your life today. Do not just listen to this and move on to the next task. Start viewing your daily emotional fluctuations, your sudden spikes of anxiety, your moments of deep melancholy, your bursts of manic energy not as fragilities. Stop viewing them as evidence that you are fundamentally broken or diseased. View them as evidence of your dynamic, adaptable nature. You are a sensitive organism responding to a highly complex, often overwhelming world. Your mind is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is trying to keep you alive and help you adapt.
And if the depth of this discussion resonated with you, if it sparked a sense of recognition regarding your own internal seawalls or the networks of your own mind, I highly recommend engaging with the source material directly to fully appreciate Dr. Francis's humanity, his clinical wisdom, and the beautiful prose he uses to describe the patients he has treated.
Absolutely. Please go out and purchase The Unfragile Mind, A Physician's Call for Restoring Hope and Humanity to Mental Health Care by Gavin Francis, with a foreword by K. Redfield Jameson. Read it, highlight it, argue with the sections you disagree with, apply the network theory to your own life, and please seek out the author on social media. Engage with his work. Share your thoughts and your own stories of adaptability with him.
The landscape of mental health care does not change simply because a new manual is published. It changes because patients, readers, and citizens force an ongoing public conversation. Adding your voice to that conversation is how we dismantle the stigma of reified diagnoses.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. If you found this exploration valuable, please follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with your friends, your family, or anyone you know who might be secretly struggling to maintain their own internal seawalls. At the start of this, we talked about that broken X-ray machine, how terrifying it is to step into the murky, unpredictable waters of the mind without a clear, objective picture to comfort us. But maybe the ultimate lesson of Dr. Francis's work is that the goal was never to fix the X-ray machine. The goal is to realize that you aren't a static, brittle bone waiting to be diagnosed as broken. You are not made of fragile glass. You are a river, constantly flowing, constantly adapting, capable of carving new paths through the hardest rock, and infinitely unfragile. Until next time, take care of yourselves, nurture your networks, and take care of each other.